I made a video and I didn't like it, so I erased it and I'm starting over. So, some of you were talking the other day about settings and rings and stuff like that, and Anuka and I were getting into this. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We were getting into this discussion on our little jewelers page that some people had mentioned that they really didn't know how to make or construct hollow rings, and that's kind of something, you know, people always ask me to come teach workshops, and I'm always hesitant because I really don't do anything that's out of the ordinary. Like a lot of you have specialties that you do, so it makes kind of sense that you'd go teach them, but I just kind of do a little bit of everything. I've always kind of been a jack of all trades. So one thing I'm really good at, though, is making hollow rings. So I thought maybe it would be kind of nice to kind of show you how I make them. I'm sure that, you know, the way I'm going to show this is not like by the books technically correct, because I've kind of had to teach myself how to do this in various ways. Yes, I went to graduate school, but I think everybody goes through a series of trial and error to figure out the best way that works for themselves, and I'm going to talk about that now. So I'm probably also going to show a few things that I've made too as well while I'm working on this, so you can kind of understand like what I was doing and how I got to the where I am now with these rings. I have a lot of stones sitting here because I'm going to talk about that first. You know, for me, jewelry is like design, basically. I have a degree in architecture, and I started taking metalsmithing as an advanced art elective for my architecture degree, and there was something about being able to sit down at this scale and design something. I have some drawings here. To design something and then, you know, spending lots of time laying out all the pieces and then, you know, putting them all together. And I think originally the reason, actually after my first semester of metals, I wasn't going to take it again because it was extremely frustrating to me that I couldn't manipulate it and put it together the way I could, say, like my basswood models in architecture. But once I figured out how to construct the metal the same way I would the wood, it kind of all started to make sense. So I think that for me, these rings are kind of like little design exercises. I do lots of different rings. In fact, I have some sitting over here. Let me move my stuff out of the way. And the video that I just erased, I actually showed more of these objects, but I'll just kind of lightly lay this here so I don't mess anything up. I think originally when I first started doing this, I saw these as being, you know, the hollow rings were a way for me to create a lot of volume and make them look like they were kind of machined out of, say, a big chunk of aluminum or a big chunk of steel or something like that. So I think my first rings, and this is one of the earliest ones that I still have, they were very, you know, the outside edges were very parallel. I don't know if that's focusing on that or not. And I, you know, back in the day when I first started, I was always told, oh, you can't create anything that creates a hollow void on the inside because it'll explode. So I always try to, like, you know, drill holes for vents. I mean, a lot of people do that. It's not just me. I will say that as I progressed, this is one of the earliest rings, you know, the holes started to get smaller. I started to kind of play around with cutting the holes out, and this actually has like I don't know if you can see that. This has kind of a more intricate design at the top. And then I actually soldered a piece of gold in here, and it makes like a jingle ring. This is kind of a cool ring. I'm in another version of this ring a few years ago for someone who wanted a commissioned ring for me, and I never got a picture of it, and I wish I had because it was a little bit different. But this one's sterling silver, 14 karat gold, and then 22 karat bimetal, which is like a thin layer of 22 karat fused to sterling, and I soldered that on top. So that, you know, and then finally I got to this ring. This is one of my favorite rings. I'll kind of try to hold it up here. This one, I know it's kind of dirty, and I don't have a polishing cloth sitting here, but I started playing around with not just using sterling and not just using gold, but using Mokame Gane as kind of like the side pieces. I've also done these where the Mokame is on these facing sides. I still have this one because it matched a bracelet that ended up selling, and I kind of wish I'd never sold it. But I don't know. I like this scale. I feel like I work really well with this scale. But as I've done these for a long time now, I've kind of tried to start pushing away from the kind of cookie cutter, you know, flat-sided rings and pushing on to things that are a little bit more complicated with respect to like craftsmanship and fabrication. So I've done some like this one, which was two. This one was kind of hard to explain. It was two squares in the dapping block, right? So they're in, kind of like the points come up on end. I then drilled a hole in the center of each one, and I pushed some type of wire, let's just say 10 gauge silver wire, doesn't really matter, through the hole. I tacked them together at the center. It's missing now. And then when they were solid together against the inside wire, I then capped each piece off and soldered all those together. And once all 4 outsides were soldered down, I removed the center, and then I went back and put a gold rivet in the middle. So this band in here is actually 14 karat gold, but it's not soldered in place. I was actually able to put it in there and then hammer the edge, and it flared the edge out and basically made it like a giant tubing rivet. So it turns into this kind of weird looking ring. Yeah, it's a little bit impractical, but I was just trying to experiment with kind of changing the shape and the way that you fabricate these types of rings. So that was kind of one of the first ones. I've also done ones where I played around with tubing. This is all made out of tubing, and then I capped off certain areas. So it's technically a hollow ring. It's just made kind of a little bit differently. I used to wear this one, so it's kind of beat up, but I probably should put all these in the tumbler. Recently, I've kind of been working with, sorry, my foot's falling asleep. Recently, I've been working with doing, with this resin. And so this one is actually domed the other direction. They're kind of like the opposite of this. Can you kind of see that? These pieces would have been like that. Actually, they fit together really well. So it's basically the same shape as that one, just corner to corner. I tacked them at the corners, and then I started putting new pieces of material on the edges. Once those were soldered in place, I cut a hole, and I inlaid a band, something kind of like that, in there. It was sticking out on either side, soldered it in place, and then finished it, did all that kind of stuff. This piece of resin that I cut, I wanted it to kind of fit into the design. So really puffy, really big. I still like the fact that it looks like a giant ring, but it doesn't weigh very much, okay? I've also done ones that have hinges. So this is one that I was making for me. I have huge knuckles, and so I wanted to make a ring that I could wear. So I thought if I made it to where you could open it, and I was going to mount, I have these neodymium magnets that I was going to mount at the top. And so basically it's like a cuff, and you can stick it on, and it would cuff around my hand, stay stuck to my hand, and then I could take it off, put on. My fingers are kind of fat right now, so I just never finished it because I couldn't quite figure out how I wanted to do the magnet on the top. I have some small magnets now that would probably work, so I probably should finish it. But anyway, so that's kind of another one that I've done. I've also done these weird ones that are 2 pieces of metal, so it's not like your standard or traditional size ring, but it's seamed down this sharp edge here. 2 pieces flared out that way, and then I soldered this bronze across the back, and then I put a piece of Mokame Gane on the top that's bronze and silver. So this one's kind of a neat ring too. It's just slightly different. It's a weird shape. This was actually a mock-up for another ring that I did that I think I have a picture of it on Facebook. It has a giant 10 or 12 karat amethyst that's like this size up in the top. I was trying to see if I could actually make the ring work the way I wanted it to work. So, but then I liked this one so much that I turned it into a ring. So I've also taken, one of the things I really like about this hollow construction is that you can do other things with it. So I actually have branched out and I've done bracelets. This is a bracelet. Again, this is a really old bracelet, so it's very flat on the sides, but you can see there's an internal band, an external 6-section band, pieces soldered on the end. I etched the inside, which I really like. I used to do a lot of etching. The top is actually etched, but I had some problems with fire scale on this one, and I had to go back and polish the whole surface because I would rather, and it almost completely polished off my etching, which is one of the reasons why I still have this. I love this bracelet. These are glass Marini that I made in the hot shop, but excuse me, but I decided to just kind of hold on to it because I wasn't really sure. This had a matching ring that was stolen in Seattle too, so I just didn't feel comfortable selling the bracelet without the ring. It had this same stone in it, but anyway, this is a brooch that I made pretty recently. I've been playing around with inlay and stuff too, so this one has actually 3 shapes, a circle, a triangle, and a square of the bronze. It's the same Mokame that's in this ring. It's bronze and sterling silver. I don't know if you can see that. So when this was flat as a piece, I inlaid those first, and then I scored and folded back behind it, folded it into 5 sections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I started to fabricate it by adding the pieces on the top and bottom, and then I added a backing. My pin that I put in here, I made out of nickel, and it wasn't strong enough, and it ended up falling apart. So the next time I do it, I'm going to do it with steel. So I'm going to fix this. These were supposed to be like these cool things you could wear that look like they were projecting out from your body. They were kind of like architectural pieces that I kind of wanted to have happen. This one actually, if someone had a small wrist, would actually probably make a better bracelet. But I've already soldered all this stuff on here, and I'd have to go back and kind of, I might be able to maybe I could make it for a ponytail holder. That might be kind of cool. Anyway, that's kind of how I do that stuff. I kind of wanted to talk about that. You know, I've also done like sculptural rings and things like this that are like really huge and gigantic. I don't think jewelry has to necessarily always be able to be worn. I think you can use it as tiny little sculptures. So there's bugs flying around here. I apologize. I'm outside in the garage, and it's summer in Texas. So I thought what I'd kind of also like to talk about too is like the materials that I use. I'm going to set these off to the side. And the bug just flew right in my face. I have a lot of stones. I don't use them all the time. Unlike a lot of you, my full-time job is teaching, so I don't have a lot of extra time to make jewelry. But I love making it, so I continue to do it. But I have a lot of this stuff just like stockpiled. Anyway, I like to look at my stones that I think would work for rings, and I kind of design the ring around the stone. So this was one I was working on the other day. It's a druzy that has this really lovely kind of peach color, and I already made the bezel for it, and I was trying to figure out something that I could make for that. And I think what I'll probably do is end up making a type of hollow ring for the bottom of this. I was kind of drawing it here. I don't know if you can see that, but I was kind of drawing it here, kind of coming up with some designs. And I'll try to put something together. And I want to kind of show you how I would solder it. I mean, a lot of the soldering steps that I take are very similar to what you would do on anything else. So it's not like above and beyond, what you already know. It's just, I might, do something a little bit different. So these rings, the basic rings, like a simple one like this is probably the simplest type of ring like this, is a front, a back, flat sheet, 20 gauge. I think the first one I made was 18 gauge, and then I went to 20, and then I tried 22, and 22 is a little thin, especially since I like to polish all of my fire scale off, and by the time you polish all your fire scale off and everything, you're probably down to 22 gauge, and sanding and all that kind of stuff. So I tell everybody 20 gauge. I think it works really well. If it were gold, I would do 22 or 24. It would depend on the type of gold and like how much polishing I was going to do. So this one is like probably the simplest type of hollow ring. And I had, where did we go? So basically I would construct a band, strip of metal, 20 gauge, laid out. I usually stamp my name and the date, sterling, whatever, if you want to do that. When it's flat on a metal plate, I do all that first, and then I bring it up, file the inside edge. You all know how to make a band ring, I hope. And then I solder it with hard solder, okay? And yes, there's a whole bunch, I don't know if you can see that, there's a whole bunch of hard solder there. I have learned with these rings that you want to almost over solder, and I'll explain why in a second when I start to talk about the fabrication part. I know a lot of people who like to solder things and then clean them up and then keep soldering and then clean them up and then keep soldering. I used to do that myself, but it led to a lot of pits and problems later on. The one thing that I have learned about silver solder and soldering with like sterling silver, and not necessarily with argentium. I haven't really. I've made one. I actually think this ring is argentium. I've used argentium once or twice for hollow rings, but I haven't really done it enough to really make up my mind yet. But with sterling, the solder that you use, every time you heat it, it keeps depleting itself. So basically, and you have to kind of think about like what they put into the solder. Like easy solder is like 50 to 60% real silver, and the rest of it is basically like brass and other things they add to it, so it will actually melt at a slightly lower temperature and fuse your metal together. It also doesn't look the same color as sterling silver. Medium's a little bit better. It's got a little more silver in it. 65% or something like that. And that's another thing you need to look into. Every manufacturer that manufactures their own solder, they have slightly different variances of their amount of real silver that's in their solder. So theoretically, if you kind of look and look around, there's not just hard, medium, and easy. You can find extra easy. You can find extra hard, like IT solder, which they use for enameling and stuff like that. So that's 5 right there. But I've actually found solders that actually kind of fit between medium and hard. So they're kind of like medium hard, and I've actually found ones that are a little bit hotter than the hard solder. So there's ways you can kind of work around multiple solder joints by getting solders from different companies. Do you have to do that? No. Because what I've learned is every time you heat the metal and melt the solder, the next time you heat it, it starts to deplete a little bit more of those alloyed metals that they add to the solder in the first place. So basically your hard solder then kind of becomes 50, 75 degrees of a higher melting point type of solder. I know that sounds kind of weird because you're burning more of the impurities out, which also makes sense why if you've heated things like this multiple times and you look at the surface of the actual solder, it looks like it's starting to reticulate. It's kind of starting to shrink down and it's losing all of those extra metals that are inside of it. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when you're soldering anything like this, you don't want to remove any of the extra solder until the very end, because you want to leave all that extra solder on there for every time you heat it. It helps keep the seam pit free, basically. Okay. Now there are exceptions to the rule. You know, like there might be, I don't have one sitting here in front of me, but you might have a ring where you have to cut into it and file something. You know, like if I needed to cut something out of this and solder something in here before I was completely done, then I had to go ahead and clean that surface off because I want to solder something to the surface. So the seam right here at the lower bottom and at the top is actually now exposed. Would I have problems with that? Maybe. I'm probably going to have to deal with that. I might have to put a little bit of yellow ochre or whiteout works pretty well just to protect that seam from that solder from remelting. Whether you get it hot enough for it to melt actually all the way, you know what I might do on this one actually is like make an external kind of thing and add a thing to the top and rivet it on. I think that's I've kind of learned how to do that, and I think that works better for me. So then I won't actually have to heat this ring again. I can just add everything on, or mechanically with screws and bolts or rivets or whatever. So that being said, there's a lot of things you kind of have to think about. I'm moving around again. Sorry. Basically, inside band, we kind of talked about that. I don't know where it went. I can't see it. Right here. So inside band, make it to whatever size you want. I'm not going to go over on how to make a band ring because I think you guys probably all know how to make bands. And then you want to have your sheet. I just have a scrap sheet here. This is thinner than what I normally use. This should be 20 gauge. Make sure you sand the solder edge that you're getting ready to solder down really well. You can file it, but I also go back with like 220 sandpaper. Make sure it's like dead on flat. Like when you put that sucker up to a light, you don't want to be able to see any light coming through the seam. And then you put that piece down, you get the outside piece that you're going to form, if this is how you're going to make your ring. You get this piece set up, and then you're going to solder that. Flux it, you can cut little, I use wire solder. Some people use the Palions. I've learned that for doing this type of work, the wire solder works the best. You end up using too much solder, but like I said before, that ends up helping you later on. So I don't use paste solder. The only thing I use paste solder for is if here I'll give you an example. When I've woven chains and I want to solder a cap that I made onto the end, I'll put paste solder up in there and I'll stick that in there and solder it into place. That's the only way I use that kind of solder. And actually this was a ring that I made that I turned into a pendant because one of my students dropped it and broke the stones. Long story short, so that's that. Anyway, makes sense? So sand, flux, make sure all your metal's clean, Scotch-Brite it, whatever. Set it down on here, and then I put one of these, I have one of these little steel grate things that actually goes on one of those tripods that you can put up off the table and then you can heat from underneath. I usually just set this right onto my my soldering brick, which is, I use ceramic bricks from like the ceramic store, and it gives me enough elevation off the brick that I can actually, set my stuff on here and shoot the torch down, and it rebounds kind of down through the thing and back up underneath the piece, and I'm able to heat it that way. I think it works real well. if you overheat your metal, sometimes the lines from this can cause weird heating, like fire scale marks, and or you can melt your ring down into it and then it's a nightmare. But so I don't know, I sometimes don't even use this, and I just solder directly on my ceramic brick, or if you will use charcoal, that's fine too. Charcoal just gets really damaged by the flux, so I don't know, you have to kind of play around with that. But I used to use these honeycomb. These things are really awesome. It's like a honeycomb soldering brick, but again, these get damaged a lot from the flux, and so I don't use these very often anymore because they're expensive and they break really easily, hence this one being broken. And it does do an awesome job of heating stuff up, but they don't last quite as long. So I just went back to the traditional, I don't know if you can see it over there, just fire bricks. So solder everything down. Let's say we already have this solder down to this and we have the outside solder down. Then it's time to put the other side on. And you're like, oh, well, if I turn that over, I can't see down through where my finger's supposed to go. So usually what I do is once this is soldered down to the sheet, I mark a little place in there. I take my center punch a hole, drill it out, and I remove that interior section. But remember what I said a minute ago. When you're cutting this inside part out, do not get your saw blade right up against the inside of this band. You want to leave probably a 1/16 of an inch flange all the way around it, and that will hold all that extra solder in there and keep it nice and pit free until the very end, okay? But you do want to remove a little bit of this, so then when we flip it over, you end up having a hole in here so you can see down inside of it, and you can put more solder down on the other side for the other section to solder to. And then when you're done, you basically have something like this. This ring, if you notice, does not have a vent hole. So if I were to solder anything else to this, I'm going to have to either pierce this somehow, which I might do if I put, who's to say I might, these are some little pieces of bezel wire. Let's just say I wanted to set like a square stone on this, I could put like a square bezel on here, right? And then when that was soldered down, I could then pierce right, or actually I probably would do this beforehand. I would probably figure out where I want the bezel, and then I would mark a hole, drill a hole, then there's a hole in the ring, and then I can solder the bezel down, not worry about the ring getting all weird and puffy on the inside. I've actually had rings that were a little thinner. You get so much heat build up on the inside that they puff out, or you pop a seam, and then you've got a whole seam that you have to deal with and try to resolder it, which you can do, but it's not easy. So always have a vent hole of some sort. Now, I do have some rings that I've done 1 or 2 rings where I didn't have to have a vent hole, but think about the jewelers that come after you. If someone were to take a ring like this into someone that likes to do jewelry repair, and you don't have any vent hole, and you don't have any way for them to actually go back and reheat it, then it's going to cause problems later on. So I always tell people that they should be thinking not necessarily just about what they're making, but they need to think about if someone needs to repair it later on. So I always try to put a hole somewhere. Most of my rings have one whole section that's a hole, and this has a piece of mocha on the top that was supposed to go, the reason I didn't do anything with this was supposed to move back and forth. It kind of goes back and forth, but it didn't really work exactly the way I wanted it to. I kind of like the shape of it, but you have to kind of plan all that stuff out, okay? So soldering steps, cut the stuff out, make sure when you're cutting out you leave enough of an edge when you're cutting out, and then you can start to work with all the stuff that you're working with. I think for me it's all about the stones and the setting and pushing the boundaries of what people generally consider a ring. A lot of the first ones I did were kind of typical, kind of like hollow rings. I can say that because I can look back at my own work and say, oh yeah, those are kind of boring. They're not necessarily boring shapes, they're just kind of boring with respect to technical ability. But I finally, I have this ring here, I was going to show this one. This is the ring I just finished, and it's my favorite one that I've ever made because it doesn't look like a hollow ring. I was able to really accentuate the curves on this ring, and I did such a good soldering job that there's no pits, and this craftsmanship on this is really good. It's really dirty right now. I probably need to clean it, but this is the ring that I had a different topper on, and I screwed it all up, and I broke a stone, and I had to make a new topper. And then the second topper, which is this one, as I was setting the new tourmaline in there, I hit it too hard, and it pushed the arches down, and it flared up, and it was a nightmare. So Peter recommended on our little Golden Jewelers group that I just make it out of gold, and so I went ahead and made the topper out of 14 karat gold, silver, and tourmaline, and I just riveted the topper onto the ring, and I kind of like working that way. I was actually thinking about maybe even tying it into these holes on the side. I think that's why I had those there in the first place, but I kind of like the way they look in the end anyway, so I just left them. But what I love about this ring is really the shape of the actual ring. It's very smooth. It's very, everything that you see here was a piece of metal that I soldered on here. So it started off as a kind of slightly domed, not really domed, but like rolled in one direction, piece of metal, another one on that side. I think I did the same technique I did that I talked about earlier, where I actually drilled a hole from this sheet into the other sheet, and I stuck a wire down through it to hold them in position so I could get them soldered exactly the separation apart. And then I went back slowly and soldered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a silver piece on the top, all around one step at a time. And then I kind of went back and started to clean it all up. I got ahead of myself, and I got really impatient, and I wanted to see what the ring was going to look like. So I sanded and filed too much of the flange that I was talking about earlier, the extra material off. And so I kind of knew that I wasn't going to be able to heat this ring again unless I did something mechanical, and that's why I decided to do this part separate and then attach it, which I actually really like doing. And if someone wanted to repair this later on, they could just file those two little rivets out, pull this whole top part off, fix it, and then put it back on and put two little pieces of tubing in there and fix it. So it'd be really easy to fix. Well, not easy, but it would be easier. So I don't know. I like this ring. And I think it looks better with the green tourmaline than with the garnet. So I think it turned out okay. That's kind of what I do. You have to kind of decide how you want your stones to sit on there too. I have all these little stones here. I wanted to really make a ring for you guys, and I'm going to. I just don't know exactly which stone I want to use. I like to do things this is a piece of glass that I made, which would kind of make a neat stone. It's a little big. And I like to make my rings kind of match the shape of my stones, so that would make kind of a gigantic ring, and I think it's probably a little too large. I have some little tourmalines here. I might do something with that. That might be kind of a neat. Maybe set it sideways or something. I kind of like that. So maybe I'll play around with that, and we'll go with that. But I'm going to stop the video right here, and then I'll add another video in of me making a ring. So